see people that I have not seen for a long, long time. So, just as the Glimmerglass Festival is returning to the Alice Bush Opera Theater, the Talking Opera series is returning live instead of being directed from my kitchen table. But one thing that we did learn through the pandemic was the value of recording, which Maestro had suggested we start doing anyway. So the program that he did last week that was arranged by his friend, Abby Gibson, and she arranged the Fenimore Museum to let us use the space, was recorded, and Mary Margaret Kuhn, who's managing all of the website stuff right now, has been able to get it uploaded to our Glimmerglass Guild website. So if you missed that program as I did, or if you want to see it again, or if you want to send it along to your friends or other people that you think might be interested in buying a ticket to the opera, please do so. Now this is our first talking opera in this lovely church, and I want to thank Pastor Mike and the board of the First Baptist Church in Cooperstown, and Cindy Falk, who's doing the technical stuff, the sound, and the recording for us, for being willing to let us do this series in their sanctuary. So thank you so much. I'm so excited about it. So, our speaker again tonight is Maestro Joseph Culinari. And I'm going to give you a little background on him. I know you may all know him very well, but I want you to pass the recording on to other people. He first appeared at the podium at the Glimmerglass Festival in 2009, conducting Rossini's La Cenerentola. In 2013, he was named music director of the festival. If you visit his website and look at his biography, you will see how much he brings to this position. And you will see that he is very active in conducting in many parts of the world. The Metropolitan Opera, Cologne, yes, many, many places other than, in addition to Glimmerglass. I think that, or I asked tonight, his first instrument was the piano, which he began studying as a young boy. With talent, much hard work and practicing, his passion for music grew, and he studied organ, which, as you can see up here, is a much more complex keyboard instrument than the piano is. He earned music degrees at New York University and Westminster Choir College. He began his professional music career as an organist and choir director. His journey into opera and operatic conducting was through positions as chorus master of the New Jersey State Opera and the New York City Opera. This background in working with voices, I think it's got to be really important in his work at Glimmerglass. And it continued to be an asset in 1987 when he began his conducting career at New York City Opera. Along the way, he developed a passion, an outstanding reputation for nurturing young musicians, especially when he had a 20-year tenure as the artistic director of opera at the Mannes School of Music, New York City. How fortunate our Glimmerglass young artists are to benefit from his wisdom. As I've been learning through the years, as music director at Glimmerglass, he's involved in so many elements of the festival. He has input into choosing repertoire. He chooses and adapts the scores that will be used. He creatively collaborates with playwrights and the festival's dramaturg. And he conducts the wonderful Glimmerglass Festival Orchestra, which we will hear in a few weeks. He's very personable and gracious in interacting with patrons and donors. He's a frequent public speaker and educator on the topic of opera. And he's always willing to participate in our Talking Opera series. Tonight we will have his insights into Bizet's Carmen. And having heard him talk about familiar operas before, I know that he will have a mature view of this, but he will also bring in something fresh and new. So I welcome Maestro Collinari.
Kathy, thanks for that splendid introduction with so many facets of the things I do. Remind me to think back some time and be grateful for all those days as well too. It's wonderful to see you all. I hope you're not thinking, oh, no, another Carmen. Yeah, I've seen that one with another Carmen. Good. Okay, I'm glad. Because it's certainly one of the keystones of what we call the canon or the standard repertory. Carmen was largely a failure at its world premiere in 1875. And of course, that always is a good thing, because other operas that failed at the world premiere, Madame Butterfly, that usually means that puts the stamp of it's going to have, the longest approval rating ever to go. So, these what was once considered a failure becomes, something to be treasured. And I'm thrilled that Carmen is one of those pieces. Of course, Bizet had a shortish life. He died the year of the world premiere of Carmen. Carmen was at its world premiere in the early part of March of 1875, and Bizet died in October. Some people say he was ailing, that he had frail health, and there were some say that the barrage of bad reviews from the critics are what actually killed him, or hastened his death in any case. Well, who knows? I mean, the first thing we have to remember is we cannot allow the critics to get under our skin like that and cause us any kind of anxiety or death at all. But nonetheless, I'm sure it did not make for a happy time for Bizet, certainly with this absolutely wonderful opera and so many of the facets of which we'll talk about tonight. Now, of course, it's an iconic opera. I mean, it has tunes that everybody knows. I mean, you could sing the Habanera, in Price Chopper, and people will recognize it. And say, oh, yeah, I know that. It's I've heard that. It's from some opera or something. I mean, so there is music in it that people know. It has been usurped for all kinds of commercial use, television, film. You see it all over the place. With cartoons, people always say to me, why do cartoons use so much classical music? Because it's in the public domain and it's free. They don't have to pay for it. Anyway, but it's good because what it does is it starts to implant the idea of this music in people's minds. So I think that, from a young age, that's really great. I mean, I heard all these pieces growing up, watching Warner Brothers cartoons, and then all of a sudden, I started studying, and I thought, wait a minute, I know that. So it's a wonderful thing because it infiltrates our society and our minds and our education and our hearts, and in a very, very positive way. So Georges Bizet, short life, 35 years. Like Mozart, 35 years. Like Vincenzo Bellini, 35 years. It's kind of an unfortunate thing. Luckily for Verdi, we have him, into his 80s. But it's not to be with everyone. Now, Bizet wrote or planned or projected like 15 plus operas, but there are only a handful for which he's known. The one that sort of put him on the map in 1863, when he was, all but in his 20s, the Pearl Fishers, Les Pêcheurs de Perles, followed by La Jolie Fille du Perth, the Jolly Maid of Perth, 1867. Then Jamilé, one-act opera of 1872, lovely piece but not often done. And then Carmen, 1875. Before that, there were his very early student works, a piece called Le Docteur Miracle, Dr. Miracle of 1856, when he was like 18. other pieces that were projected or never completed, Don Procopio, Esmeralda, Don Rodrigue, you know, which he worked on during Carmen, and then, you know, the score was destroyed or burned or something. So, you know, it's a lot of work when you think about it, and certainly about as much as Puccini, but only very, very little of it survives, again, because of certainly his early years, and the fact that these things were just not, I guess, these scores were just not cared for. So in order to understand Carmen, I think, you know, I mean, I'm sure, is there anybody here who's never seen it? Don't be shy, I mean, it's okay. Not everybody has seen everything. I would just love to know. All right, so everybody has been to, everybody has been to the theater and has seen it, Carmen, right? That's pretty much what I was expecting. And because if there's somebody who hasn't, I was going to arrange for champagne when you come to the Opera House, because it's a big occasion. So, everyone has seen it. To really get a feel for it, we have to sort of listen and think first about what kind of a life, artistic life, what kind of musical life, what kind of theatrical life was happening in Paris in the middle part of the 19th century. I have to say, if there were any other time other than now in which I could live, I'd opt for mid-19th century Paris. The opera scene was unbelievable. This is, of course, what we call the Second Empire. And these are the years that stretch from 1852 to 1870. Now, Paris was pleasure mad. Okay? This was, you know, we call it, you know, the city of lights. It was the city of pleasure, of great theater and great opera and beautiful architecture and beautiful boulevards and beautiful theaters in which to enjoy the opera and in which to enjoy the plays and cafes and restaurants. And I mean, the scene was unbelievable. You think about, you know, the great painting of that period, and you get a real kind of eye, a lens into what Paris was like in the mid and latter portion of the 19th century. I mean, what an incredible city. It was also, and of course as an Italian, I'm reluctant to say this, but it was the operatic capital of the world. I know, I used to think for a long time that, you know, Italy had the kind of monopoly on that. But it was not. As important as you know, Italia is for and was for opera, but it was Second Empire Paris. Paris was the operatic capital of the world. In fact, any composer who needed to prove their worth had to have a Parisian premiere. Verdi, for example, there are several works of his that had very important premieres in Italy, at Scala, in Milan, for example, or Fenice, but the work really didn't have that stamp of approval until it had a successful Parisian premiere. So even the later works, like Otello, 1888, 1887, you know, it was not until the Parisian premiere when you could really say, now it had international status. So it's the European Center for Opera in all of its forms. And what was incredible about opera in Paris is that there were several types and styles. Here what we tend to think of, oh, you know, I'm going to the opera, and you go to Glimmerglass, or you go to the Met, or you go to Chicago Lyric, or you go to a theater where you see comic operas and serious operas and tragedies and short pieces and long pieces, and you know what I mean, you see all different kinds of opera. But the French had everything perfectly and wonderfully categorized with specific theaters, with certain kinds of design, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So this is an era in Paris of great material brilliance and luxury. Now, interestingly enough, there were hardly any performances from orchestras of works by Beethoven or Schumann. I mean, these are composers, right, in the German symphonic tradition. Wagner evoked horror and contempt from the French. The one thing that the French disliked is they did not want to be preached at, if I can use that term, from the stage of the theater. They went for pleasure. They went for the tunes, they went for the great singers, they went for the orchestra playing, they went for the spectacle on the stage. But they did not want to be told how to believe or how to think, or they felt they had all of that. So they were looking really for the entertainment value, the energy and excitement of what great theater can bring. Even their own Charles Gounod struggled to get a hearing. Faust, or Faust as they would call it. And a wonderful and very important opera, Romeo and Juliet, based on the Shakespeare. That's to the French, that those stories were just, Faust was German, that was Goethe. And Romeo was, that was Shakespeare, that was English, that was not their thing. So, concert halls, instead of you going to hear Beethoven and Schumann, you would go to the concert hall and found that it was dominated by the great virtuosi of Europe. Franz Liszt, the great pianist. Niccolò Paganini, the great Italian violinist. Okay? And the great singers in the opera houses, like Gilbert Dupré, the great tenor, or Giuditta Pasta, okay? Important Italian singers of the early part of the 19th century. And the Parisians took these great virtuosos into their hearts. That's what they went. They went to be excited by the arts. They went to the brilliance of Liszt and the brilliance of Paganini and Pasta and Dupré. This never eat almonds before a lecture. I may have. Anyway, I'm fine. I tested negative yesterday. Because, oh my God, he's coughing on us. We're at a super spreader event. Anyway, I love almonds, but they do that thing in your throat. There we go. Great. Aquafina. Nothing better than that. Salute a tutti voi. There we go. Okay, so this is the milieu into which Bizet finds himself. This is the kind of theater, this is the kind of literature, this is the kind of art, this is the kind of architecture. This is the excitement of Second Empire Paris. So, at the opera, what did you hear? Well, certainly the composers of France, like Halévy, like Meyerbeer, these were the composers of the Paris Opera, the Grand Opera, the big spectacle pieces with big casts, big choruses, and fabulous stagings, and lighting effects that, for the 19th century were pretty amazing. And in some places, they could show the, erupting volcanoes on stage. Paris was known to have the most sophisticated stage equipment. The orchestras in Paris had all the latest innovations in musical instruments. All the great brass and woodwind instrument makers were in Paris. And people like, Adolphe Sax, with the invention of the saxophone, all right? They're innovating new instruments, new sounds, new colors, certainly French horns, we call it the French horn, obviously, the horn and trumpets and trombones. The greatest of the brass instruments are made in factories in Paris. The harp gets a tremendous boost, with the factory of Erard, for example. The piano factory Paris. I mean, they're turning out all of these great instruments and everything, the latest technical innovations. The Paris Opera Orchestra had specific, instruments and combinations of instruments. One of the things that you find very common if you go to Paris and you go to the Grand Opera, go to the Opéra, and you hear an opera by Meyerbeer, let's say Halévy. The standard configuration in the woodwinds is 4 bassoons. Now the classical orchestra of Mozart and Haydn, it's usually 2 bassoons. As you move into the 19th century, Puccini would use 3, sometimes 2 regular bassoons and a contrabassoon, this big twisty thing that has very low notes. But the idea of the 4 bassoons was a very French sound, like this quartet of very kind of mournful instruments. It was a very specific color. It influenced Verdi a great deal, who spent a lot of time in Paris and certainly had operas done at the Paris Opera. So much so that the Requiem, Don Carlos, they all have 4 bassoons. Verdi wrote those pieces. He was so influenced by the Parisian sound, what the orchestras were doing, what they were getting. Also the composers, besides Meyerbeer, besides Halévy, besides their beloved French composers, there was a rage for the Italian composers. Rossini, who actually moved to Paris in the 1820s when he retired from composing opera, he moved to Paris and became, like the toast of the city. Bellini, Donizetti, wrote, not only had their own operas performed, but they were commissioned and wrote operas like Donizetti, La Fille du Régiment, The Daughter of the Regiment, originally French libretto. These are composers that were beloved by the French. In fact, Donizetti had such success in Paris that the native French, Hector Berlioz, a wonderful composer in his own right, was horribly jealous and envious of Monsieur Donizetti, whose works, were getting tremendous hearing and tremendous, acceptance. Even Verdi, who wrote, for example, Don Carlos, later Don Carlos, we know the Italian title, but pieces that were commissioned for the theaters in Paris. So there was a great love of Italian style, Italian opera, Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, Verdi, the great composers of that time. They wanted that, and even to the point where, in those days, when you heard opera performed, it was usually in the language of the audience. If you went to, a Mozart opera, which of course they would never have done, but let's say you did, or you went to, an opera by Verdi, everything was translated into French. Everything was done in the language of. But there was also a trend in Paris, and very much on the cutting edge in this way. There was a trend in Paris for the Italian operas in their original language. And they set up a specific theater called the Théâtre des Italiens, which means the theater of the Italians, the Italian theater, where you went and you heard the operas with the Italian text performed in the original Italian language. So, there was, again, they were mad for this kind of love and theater and all of this. So, you're living in mid-19th century Paris and you say to yourself, I want to go to the opera tonight. What will I see? Where will I go? Well, okay, so let's sort of set up a line, okay? Let's say the most elaborate over here to this side. And that would be the Grand Opera, okay? You'd think the great Palais Garnier. This is opera, first of all, that is complex. It is long, usually construction of 5 acts. That's very typically French, 5-act opera. Large cast, large orchestra in the pit, big chorus, a lot of supernumeraries, a lot of, people running around the stage, and whatever animals you need. If you needed horses or, chickens or geese or whatever, they had all that. The directors could do whatever they wanted because they had the most up-to-date stage machinery, revolving stages and things that dropped and elevators. I mean, you know, when you think days really before, you know, mechanics, now everything digital, computerized, lighting effects that, you know, were sort of unheard of in Italy. I mean, they were, you know, de style, as they say. They were in the style of whatever was, you know, the latest fashion in the opera house. And they put on these spectacular operas that had one extra thing in them that nobody else was really doing. There were, I wouldn't say never, but at the Grand Opera, one thing that you could count on would be a big opera with a ballet. The ballet was, as the French would say, de rigueur, meaning required. So if an Italian composer, or even a French composer, were transferring a work from another kind of theater, like Verdi, let's say, or Donizetti, but when they brought it to the Paris Opera, when Verdi's Macbeth had its premiere at the Paris Opera, now Verdi had, in the original version, he had done something in 1847 in Italy, as you may know. He did something very innovative. He had a small dance sequence in the opera. But when he went to have it done at the Paris Opera, they said, no, it's not enough. You have to have a big, elaborate ballet. And he added a big ballet to it. Otello, now it's an opera, you think, God, nobody would put a ballet in that. There is a big ballet in Otello that he added for Paris. It comes actually in the third act with the arrival of the Venetian ambassadors and that particular scene. It's like they all arrive, and then the people of Cyprus say, oh, and we've planned a wonderful entertainment for you. Our Cyprus dance company is going to come out and do some characteristic things. And Verdi writes this 4-movement suite of dances. They're really wonderful. I played them in a concert one time in Austria, and the audience just thought, wow, who wrote that? And it was Verdi. I mean, and it's not long, but it's wonderful stuff. So the idea then of a composer that the ballet was of such importance to the French Grand Opera that it was required to have it. Okay, it had these sequence of dances had to be added. Faust by Gounod was transferred from the Théâtre Lyrique to the Grand Opera, and when he did that, didn't have a ballet. He had the ballet for that, required. So that's the flavor of the Grand Opera. Everything, grand in every way. It's a perfect descriptor. Now, let's say you were looking for an evening that was maybe a little less grand. So you would attend then what was called the Théâtre Lyrique, the lyric theater. Here you would get something that was close to Grand Opera, but subject matter that was less lofty. This is where Faust had its first performances. The Lyrique was opposed in certain sense in subject matter. Grand Opera was very romantic. These were the great subjects of, you know, the battle of heaven and hell, and the Les Huguenots, Meyerbeer, you know, that great story from, you know, religious history of sort of the Huguenots against the Roman Catholics and those big religious wars, and who's getting burned at the stake and who's not allowed to practice their religion and all of that. That's what Le Prophète, pieces like that, you know, lots of burnings at the stake and all that things. Religious processions at the Grand Opera is another thing they love. The Roman Church in France, in Paris, they turned a blind eye to that. There wasn't the censorship like there was in Italy. But no, you can't show that. No, you can't show that. No, you can't show a bishop on the stage. You can't have the Pope. You can't do none of that. Then the Lyrique was like a less elaborate version. Shorter operas sometimes, and again, less elaborate, sometimes a slightly more intimate kind of subject matter. But you say, no, I need something maybe a little different than that. I would really like something maybe that combined singing with spoken dialogue in between. I'm not interested maybe in like, you know, grand recitative. I want something a little more, you know, immediate. Then you would go to the Théâtre de l'Opéra Comique, which the word comique in French, it sounds like comic, but it bears two meanings. Comique in the sense of humorous, funny subject, or comique in the sense of sort of everyday, common characters. At the Comique, you would see an opera that would usually have a happy ending. It would have characters that were recognizable. They would not be royalty. They would not be characters from the past. They would be kind of present-day people. Okay, it was about, the subject matter was very much about, what was going on in people's lives at the time. It was that kind of commonality. As I said, happy ending. Sometimes they were humorous operas. They had funny endings. They had stock characters. They had always the lyric soprano who was kind of like, the girl next door. They had the heroic tenor. They had the villain, usually a mezzo or a bass, a lower, voice of that expresses maturity or evil, which was a kind of common archetype in European opera in general. Would have a chorus, but again, not as elaborate. Ballet was not required at the Comique. Not required. They might have had some dance or here and there, but it was not a requirement like the Grand Opera. But what was significant is that it had spoken dialogue in between the musical numbers. So there would be, an aria, two or something, a chorus, an overture, and then the characters, instead of singing recitative, we know from the bel canto and 18th century before that, a keyboard instrument like a harpsichord or forte piano, and they sing that kind of speech, heightened speech singing. Okay, none of that. This was spoken dialogue. The comique comes in there. Now, the comique actually came late because after the Grand Opera and the Lyrique, the next step over for a long time at the beginning of the 19th century was then a step over to vaudeville. Okay? And vaudeville was very loose. Vaudeville didn't necessarily have to have a story threaded together. It could or it couldn't. It could be like a series of reviews. It was closely aligned to something that was called the café concert, where you would go to one of these, in fact, you can see in some of the painting of the end of the 19th century of Monet, Manet, these evenings at the cafe, and you see all these people sitting at tables, and in the background you can see a stage, and there would be comedians and people, dancing and singing pop songs, and there would be, and again, very loose, just, not a story or some complicated plots followed, no specific staging. The vaudeville also was similar to that. It was held in a theater, but again, very loose, full of the popular songs and dance movements, the two-step and the polka and all of that. It was all of that in that kind of grouping of café concert and vaudeville. And then came the comique with its spoken dialogue. And then in between there, audiences started thinking, we love the comique with its spoken dialogue, and we love the vaudeville, but it's not sophisticated enough. We want something that's got a true story. And a composer like Jacques Offenbach jumps into the breach, and he gives us operetta, French operetta. And it's there, those of you who were at the festival last summer, La Péricole, saw our version of that. Again, they have the elements, the serious musical elements of opera comique, which is its next door neighbor, but it has the spoken dialogue, and it has the dance forms and the comic couple and the kind of popular vocal pieces, or in that style at least, there's, Offenbach with the can-can and those wonderful waltz tunes and all of that. So now you have completed by mid to moving into the second half of the 19th century. Look at this kind of theatrical entertainment you have. Café concert, vaudeville, operetta, opera comique, théâtre lyrique, grand opéra, and the Théâtre des Italiens, in case you wanted to hear something in Italian. I mean, this is what a fantastic menu of possibilities this would be. I mean, I think, God, to live the life, what a life that would have been. I mean, just tremendous kind of theatrical energy happening in Paris at the time. So into this milieu comes Georges Bizet. Now, Bizet was the son of a singing teacher, his father. His mother was the sister of a rather well-known pianist, and she herself was a gifted amateur pianist. So he grew up with music in the house. He entered the Great Paris Conservatory at the age of 9. He was a very precocious young musician and a very gifted pianist. At the age of 17, he wrote the Symphony in C. I love that piece. It is a very sophisticated little piece. And he wrote it very quickly under the influence of the music of Beethoven, Mozart. It has a well-balanced orchestration of 2 on a part, very much in Viennese classical style, but with French melody and that kind of verve rhythm. It's an absolutely incredible piece. At age 20, he wins a very famous prize, competitive prize for composers and other artists as well too, called the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize. It was a 5-year pension, they called it, or a stipend, which included 2 years of study at the French Academy in Rome. Not a bad place to go and kind of work and compose on your own for 2 years. You were expected to compose an opera, sacred works, song works, symphonic works, and there was a lot going there. But Bizet himself said at this time, I don't want to do anything that's chic. He said, I want to be serious. I want to do something that's lasting and important. So he wins this famous prize and gets going and begins his compositional career. Les Pêcheurs de Perles, as I mentioned, the Pearl Fishers, is the first opera that put him on the map. A problematic opera. It has a strange ending that sometimes he didn't really complete and never went back to it and revised it, and so it presents problems when you're going to produce it. His opera, Jamilé, not well known, was produced at the Opéra Comique, and one of the directors of the Comique, Camille Delorcle, came to him and proposed a different opera for him. He said, no, he said, you know, I have something I want you to do. I want you to work with the librettists, Henri Maillac and Ludovic Halévy, as librettists. They were a very, very important pair of French librettists. And Bizet himself chose to set the novella by Prosper Mérimée, which is called Carmen. So it's into this great excitement of 19th century Paris that Bizet comes. So, meanwhile, he is writing incidental music for a play called La Lésienne. He also began for the first act of Carmen, at least finished by the summer of 1873. And then a request comes along from the baritone, who was also one of the directors of the Paris Opera, a man named Jean-Baptiste Faure. People look at his name, it's F-A-U-R-E, and they think it's Faure, but there's no accent at the end. So he's Jean-Baptiste Faure, like 1, 2, 3, Faure. And a Spanish subject, Don Rodrigue, but never completed, and the score was destroyed by fire. And no one has ever found it, so there's no reconstruction of it to my mind. So Bizet returns now to complete Carmen, and he finishes the opera in the summer of 1874. So it's about a year's worth of work. The rehearsals of Carmen were delayed because of difficulties in finding exactly the right leading lady. And eventually they settled on one Célestine Galli-Marié, who was intelligent, important for a singer, and who had a natural acting ability. Now, there was hostility in the rehearsals. In fact, a man named de Louvain, who was one of the brothers Dulocle's co-directors, who was horrified by the choice of subject. Now, for us, we think, oh, Carmen, you know, we tend to think, you know, rose in the teeth kind of thing. If you remember, like, you know, the Firestone opera years ago on TV, or I remember, you know, as a little kid, Regina Resnick, a great Carmen, great artist, great singer. I knew Regina Resnick very, very well. And I remember her one night on a Sunday night on the Ed Sullivan Show, singing in the Habanera, and you know they brought some choristers from the Met and a little set and everything, and she was there, you know, with the mantilla and the rose and the big nail on her cheek and all that, the cigarette and all of that. It was very sort of and I thought, yeah, okay, I mean, you know, gloriously sung, but seemed to sort of not represent the grit of Carmen. The novella by Mérimée, of course, is an interesting work. You can probably find it in the library or online. You can get a copy. It's very short. It's a little thin book like that. You can get it in English translation. And of course, Mérimée was a Parisian. He lived from 1803 to 1870, so he was older than Georges Bizet. He was a novelist and short story writer. And Mérimée was fond of strong, strange situations, exotic settings with blazing emotions. And he was predisposed to distancing himself in the narrative from the violence that he portrayed. He's very French. You know, he's not going to put blood and guts out there. I mean, remember, you know, when Mérimée is writing this, you know, opera about a Roma woman, beautiful woman who, you know, it's about power, and it's about, you know, obsession. Don José and Carmen is what's really at the heart of this piece. And yet, whenever he describes any violent scenes, you know, the book is set up like Don José meets someone and you know, they get into a conversation, like out of the city, and Don José tells his story. So the whole thing is like third-person narrative. So it's not direct in that way. Now remember, this is also the era of Victorien Sardou in the theater. That's La Tosca, okay? And again, end of the opera, all the main characters, they're all dead. You know, Scarpi is dead in the opera, you know, he's dead at the end of Act 2. Then comes Cavaradossi, shot at the end of Act 3, and then about 5 minutes later, Tosca goes over the wall, and that's the end. You know, everybody, there's no one left standing worth, you know, worrying about. They're all gone. So Mérimée had that way of distancing himself, but yet the opera is filled, the novella is filled with passion, it's filled with violence. Okay, it's that kind of story. Now, we know from the novella, for example, that Don José, he comes from Navarre, which is the area not far from Spain, on that, you know, that coast there. And so he's what the French would call a Navarrese. He finds himself in the army in Seville because he's had to run away from Navarre. He comes from a kind of well-to-do family, and as they say in the English translation of the novella that I have, you know, that he's a tennis player. I mean, it was a certain kind of some kind of a sport game that they played. And he first of all, he had been studying for the priesthood. Okay, he was headed to be a priest, and he gets into an argument over the game with another fellow. And they immediately take out what Mérimée describes as I think the word is maquilla. They're like heavy cudgels of wood that are sheathed in iron. So it's quite a dangerous thing. And José kills him, he beats him to death. And of course, that happens, he's got to get out of Navarre really fast. So he leaves the seminary and all that behind him. He has a mother. He also has a young woman, Micaela, who probably has eyes for him, may have been betrothed, but I think she's more like a little sister to him. She does show up in the opera. But otherwise, José has to escape quickly, and he joins the army, and he winds up being stationed in this platoon of soldiers that's stationed in Seville. Now, the character of Micaela, we all know she is the beautiful aria in Act 3. She also shows up in Act 1. She's looking for Don José, and she's come with a letter from his mother and some money and some things. And of course, the most important thing is she comes to give him a kiss, a baiser de ma mère, a kiss from your mother. Okay, and Micaela originally, she doesn't figure into the novel at all. She's mentioned, but she's not a character in the novel. So when they were working on the first draft, Bizet thought, well, we don't need that character. But the librettists, Meilhac and Hadewy, insisted that Micaela be in there because he said the opera comique will never accept it. He said the story is way too violent. This is not a typical comique story. We're already on very thin ice with a storyline like this, because they're either used to, kind of comic characters or an opera that has a happy ending. We know Carmen does not have a happy ending, and I'll tell you, the novella does not have a happy ending either. It ends like the opera. So they decide they better add Micaela. They better add somebody to soften. They need some kind of a soft character there as well, too. So the opera is given. The chorus pronounced the opera unsingable. They said it was too many words, too fast, and they couldn't sing it. The orchestra said it was unplayable. I mean, imagine if you're Bizet, there you are in the rehearsals, the chorus says, it's impossible to sing, the orchestra says it's unplayable. Where are you? Then the soprano singing Carmen comes to Bizet, and she says, Maestro, I need an aria in Act 1. And he said, what do you mean? Don't you like it the way I wrote it? She said, there is something missing. She insisted that he add an entrance aria for her. That aria is the habanera. So Bizet did not initially conceive Carmen with what has become the most signature tune, okay? The tune is based on an already existing piece. There are two tunes in Act 1. There's another one that Carmen sings when she's taunting Zuniga at her arrest, okay? So Bizet picks up some of these native kind of Spanish tunes. Remember, the habanera, okay, it refers to the city of Havana. If you look at a French score of Carmen, it's called Havanaise, Havanise. That means something from Havana, okay? Habanera is the Spanish word for it. Please do not say habanera, okay? I hear this very much, and I'm on a real mission to omit the tilde, the nye from that. So then make sure everybody, habanera, okay, great. So, this way, you go to a chic cocktail party here in Cooperstown, and you say, oh, I love the habanera, and people will just go, oh, thank you, good night. This way, you can have a really, you can show your understanding of operatic knowledge that you have, and that's one of the things I give you as a gift, see. So, the opera gets these pieces added. It has its premiere. Some of the numbers were applauded. Micaela's aria, Act 3, the duet with Don José. But the audiences were horrified by the subject. They were shocked with the character of Carmen. And Mercedes and Frasquita and Remendado and Dalcair. Who are these people? These are people for them they were the outcasts of society. They did not want to see that on the stage. No interest in that. And they felt Bizet had missed the mark. I mean, the Opera Comique was a place where families would sometimes take children that were old enough to go to the opera. Okay, that was like the first place you'd take the kids to go. Or they would have sometimes, people had parties at the opera during the intermissions before, even in those days, they would eat in the boxes and have champagne and all of that. This is a place where betrothals happened. Families would get together, a dozen, 2 dozen people, and they would be celebrating the engagement of, a young couple. I mean, so to have this kind of thing on the stage, no happy ending. The audience was, in many ways, not just shocked, they were baffled. They thought, why are they putting this on? The critics were horrified, except for one, the poet and music critic Théodore de Bonneville. And Bonneville wrote, very presciently, he said, I applaud Monsieur Bizet for having the courage to dispense with the old stock characters of the Opera Comique and to give us substantial characters of interest. That's what he saw. So, de Bonneville was the one who knew. And that's what we find that makes Carmen such an interesting, in many ways, dramatically perfect work. These are characters that you care about. This is the most important thing. I'll give you a very small bit of advice, and it works for me every time. If you go to a play, an opera, and anything theatrical, okay, anything, and I don't care whether it's, La Scala, the Paris Opera, or a local, acting company. It could be anything, any level of any type, high school, whatever. If you leave the theater caring about what has happened to those characters, you care about them, and you kind of miss them. You get to there and say, oh God, I wonder what happened to him. I wonder if his life went on or something happened or before he died. You know what I mean? You care about the characters and what happens to them. The piece is a success. If you leave saying, meh, as they say, it has not been successful. And you could have this kind of success in a high school production and have a failure of that at a big professional theater. So that's what you need to do. If you need to know if it was good or not, you may not have liked everybody in it, you may not have approved of the piece, but if you cared about the characters, then the piece is successful on that level. And if you didn't care, no one will go back and see it again or tell other people you've got to go and see this. So it's a very, very important part of your work as an audience. And yes, it is work for the public to be able to respond to what we're doing. Okay, we just started rehearsals of Carmen yesterday. I have conducted Carmen, I don't know, I don't have a number, but it's like a lot. It's up there with La Boheme. I have not done Carmen in a long time, like maybe 20 years plus. I still remember it, which is great. I haven't forgotten it. But I had to go back and restudy it, and I rethought some things. And I also found myself more confident about some choices I made when I was young, that I thought, I was really right. I used to think that, and then somebody said, oh, don't do it like that. Don't loud or so slow or faster. And I think, oh, well, I guess they know I don't, now I don't care. You get what I give you, and I'm at an age now where, here it is, love it or leave it, as they say. And I'm so happy to be coming back to it again. And I hope you like what we give you. The production is going to be quite amazing. It's a wonderful cast. If you remember Brianna Hunter from Blue, okay? Yeah, the mother in Blue, she is coming. It's going to be really good. Ian Koziara, the tenor, who was in Wagner last year, also was in The Crucible back when we did it several years when he was a young artist.